everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at something that I think a lot of people struggle with, especially in early stage drug development,
Mm.
and that's how to set drug specifications when you don't have a whole lot of data.
Yeah,
It's a tough one.
it is. It is.
We've got a great guide from Chrissy to help us out today.
All right.
So we're going to be pulling out some of the best strategies and tips from there.
Sounds good.
So let's just jump right in. Why are these specifications so important in the first place?
Well, they're kind of like your guiding star.
Right.
They make sure that every single batch of the drug you make is safe, it works the way it should, and the quality is consistent.
Right. So it's all about that reliability and consistency.
Yeah.
But like early on, you don't always have all the information you need to set those specifications with like total confidence, right?
It's true. It's definitely a challenge.
It's like you're trying to build a house, but you're missing some of the blueprints.
That's a great analogy. And that's where this whole risk-based approach comes in, which the guide really emphasizes.
Okay, a risk-based approach.
Yeah, so you can't like tackle everything at once.
Right.
You have to zero in on the stuff that really matters, the critical quality attributes or CQAs.
Okay, the CQAs, so these are like the make or break factors.
Exactly, the ones that could really impact safety or how well the drug works. Its efficacy.
Gotcha. So what are some examples of these CQAs, these big impact factors we need to keep our eyes on?
Well, it really depends on the specific drug, but some common ones are the potency of the active ingredient,
Okay.
the stability of the formulation, or like whether there's certain impurities.
Right.
Those are the things that if they're not controlled, within strict limits, it could have serious consequences.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So we've identified those like crucial factors, but how do we actually set those initial specifications, those numerical ranges, when we're still kind of in the dark about, some aspects of the drug and the manufacturing process?
Right. Well, the guide suggests a few interesting strategies.
Okay.
One is to look at existing knowledge, even if it's not, directly related to your drug.
Okay.
Think about industry benchmarks,
Right.
data from similar drugs
Yes.
that have already, gone through the approval process.
So it's like getting advice from someone who's already built a house, kind of.
Exactly.
But every drug is unique, right?
Sure.
So how can we be sure those benchmarks will like actually be relevant for our specific drug?
Right. That's a really good point.
Could we end up with specs that are too loose or too strict?
Yeah, and that's where careful evaluation is really, really important. You can't just blindly copy someone else's specs.
Right.
You have to think critically about the data, consider the unique properties of your drug, and adjust accordingly.
So it's like taking that blueprint, but then customizing it based on your specific needs and the emerging data, right?
Exactly.
The guide also talks about setting those initial ranges conservatively. So what does that actually mean in practice?
Well, it's kind of like building in a safety margin.
Okay.
You're admitting that you don't have the full picture yet.
Yeah.
So you make those ranges a bit wider than you might need.
Yeah.
Just in case.
So it's like saying, we think this range will work, but we're giving ourselves some wiggle room.
Exactly. And then as you learn more about the drug and the manufacturing process,
right,
you can start to tighten those ranges, make them more precise.
Gotcha. Got it. So it's it's a starting point.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. So all of this points to the fact that we need more data.
Right.
We've got to get out of the dark here and figure out what's going on.
Yeah.
So what are some proactive strategies that we can use to gather that crucial information early on?
Well, the guide recommends a couple of things, like running some small-scale studies.
Okay.
Things like accelerated stability testing to see how the drug breaks down over time.
Right.
Pilot batches can also be really helpful. They give you good data on the manufacturing process and setting up systems for real-time data collection during manufacturing.
Sure.
That's super important for ongoing monitoring and improvement.
So it's a mix of targeted studies and then just constantly monitoring what's happening.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's all about, building up that solid data set to support those specifications.
Yes.
Now, what I find interesting is that we have to think about the regulatory landscape right from the get-go.
Absolutely.
Even when we're working with, very limited data.
Yeah. Transparency is key here.
Okay.
The regulatory bodies need to understand why you chose the specifications you did.
Mm-hmm.
Especially when data is scarce.
So it's like inviting the regulators to be part of the process, to see our logic and the data behind our decisions.
Exactly, exactly. And that kind of openness, it builds trust.
Right.
And that's
Right.
going to make it easier to get approval down the line.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
Yeah.
So we're starting to get a sense of how to approach this data dilemma. We're
Yeah.
prioritizing, we're being conservative, we're actively trying to gather information.
Right.
The guide also mentions this idea of quality by design, or QBD.
Yes.
So how does that play into setting specifications when we don't have a lot of data?
Well, QBD is all about building quality into the product from the very beginning.
Okay.
It's a proactive approach,
Uh-huh.
focusing on really understanding the process and designing it to deliver a high-quality drug every time.
So it's not just about reacting to problems, it's about preventing them in the first place.
Exactly.
We'll be right back after a quick.
Oh, actually, let's just keep going.
Okay.
QBD, it ties right into this idea of continuous improvement.
Okay.
As you get more data, you can fine-tune the manufacturing process
Right.
and then tighten those specs, to get optimal quality and efficiency.
So it's not a set it and forget it kind of thing.
No, not at all.
It's constantly evolving as we learn more.
Exactly.
These specs are living documents, basically.
Exactly.
So how do we keep this whole process on track, It
Right.
seems like there are a lot of moving pieces here, especially with limited data.
Yeah, it does require a lot of coordination.
Right.
That's why the guide emphasizes collaboration.
Okay.
You need everyone who's involved in the drug's life cycle to be on board,
So R&D, manufacturing, quality assurance.
Everyone, yep.
It's like a well choreographed dance where every team is contributing their expertise
Exactly.
to make sure that the final product is harmonious.
Yeah, I like that.
But what if we hit a wall, despite all this collaboration and effort?
Mm-hmm.
What if we're just not sure how to move forward with setting those specifications?
That's a great question. And sometimes you just need an outside perspective,
Okay.
The guide suggests consulting with experts who have dealt with similar situations.
So don't be afraid to phone a friend.
Exactly. Sometimes a fresh set of eyes can make a big difference.
Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Now, eventually we have to scale up from those small scale studies to full production.
Right.
So how do we make sure those initial specifications will still hold up when we make that jump?
That's a really, really crucial thing to think about.
Yeah.
And the guide says we need to be thinking about scalability right from the start.
Okay.
You have to anticipate those challenges,
Right.
and build in some flexibility so you can adjust the specs as needed.
So those conservative ranges, the data gathering, the collaborative approach, it all comes into play when we scale up.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And speaking of keeping track of things, we can't forget about documentation.
Oh, yeah.
Right. We talked about leaving that trail of breadcrumbs for the regulators.
Mm.
But documentation's important for more than just that, right? Why is it important internally?
Well, it helps you build a knowledge base.
Yeah, right.
You're creating a record of your decisions,
Right.
the data you looked at,
Mm.
and the reasons behind your specifications.
Okay.
It helps you stay consistent over time,
Right.
and it allows anyone to see how those specifications came to be.
So it's not just about checking a box, it's about having a valuable resource for your team.
Right.
Both now and in the future.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're starting to see a really comprehensive picture of how to approach this whole specification setting process
Yeah.
when data is limited.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked about prioritizing those critical quality attributes,
Right.
leveraging information that's already out there,
Yeah.
embracing continuous improvement,
Mhm.
and emphasizing collaboration and documentation.
It's a lot to keep in mind.
It is.
But I think we've laid out a really good foundation
Yeah.
for navigating these challenges.
And making informed decisions.
Exactly.
And on that note, how about we take a quick...
Actually, let's keep the momentum going.
Okay.
We'll move into some specific examples and case studies in just a moment.
All right, sounds good.
Stay with us.
Stick around. Okay, so we've laid out the framework, the ideas,
Mm-hmm.
but I think it would be helpful to see how this actually works in real life,
Sure.
Can you think of any examples where this approach to setting specs when data is limited has actually led to success?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I remember this one company, they were developing a new cancer drug.
Okay.
And they were in the early stages of clinical trials, so they didn't have a lot of stability data for the drug substance.
Right.
And they needed to set some preliminary specs for a specific impurity,
Okay.
but they just didn't have enough data to to set a definitive limit.
So they were kind of stuck.
Yeah, they couldn't move forward without those specs,
Right.
but they didn't have the data to back them up.
Right, right. So what did they do?
Well, they got creative.
Yeah.
They used a few different strategies. First, they looked at data from similar molecules,
Okay.
and they found that a certain level of this impurity was always linked to problems with stability.
So they used that as a starting point,
Exactly.
even though it wasn't a perfect match?
Right.
Okay.
And then they did some accelerated stability study
Right.
to really stress the drug substance and get more data on that impurity.
Right.
And based on that new data,
Uh-huh.
they set a preliminary spec for the impurity that was, pretty conservative.
So they knew there was a gap, but they went after the information they needed?
Yeah, they were proactive about it.
Okay.
And they were really transparent with the regulators, too.
Okay.
They explained the data limitations and why they chose that specific specification.
Right.
And because they were so proactive about gathering data,
Uh-huh.
they were actually able to refine that spec later on as they got more information.
That's a great example, shows how a data-driven approach can really help in those early stages.
Absolutely.
And it sounds like documentation was a big part of this process.
Oh, for sure. For sure. They documented everything.
All right.
Every decision, every piece of data, the reasoning behind the specification.
Right.
It helped them internally,
Uh-huh.
and it gave the regulators a clear audit trail.
Perfect. Perfect. Okay, so we've seen how this works in the real world. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about collaboration.
Oh.
We've touched on it, involving different teams.
Right.
But I'd like to dig a little deeper.
Sure.
How do we actually make that collaboration effective, especially when we don't have a lot of data to work with?
Well, I think the most important thing is to create a culture of open communication
Okay.
and shared ownership.
Okay.
Everyone needs to understand, why these specs matter
Right.
and feel like they can, contribute their expertise.
So it's not just about, assigning tasks.
No, not at all.
It's about making people feel valued.
Exactly.
Exactly.
And heard.
Having regular meetings, with people from R&D, manufacturing, quality assurance, regulatory affairs.
So everyone's at the table.
Yeah. It helps everyone share information and make decisions together.
So you're bringing all those different perspectives together.
Yep.
And leveraging the wisdom of the whole team.
Exactly.
And having clear roles and responsibilities is important too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. If everyone knows what they're supposed to be doing, it makes the whole process smoother.
Right. So it's like having a game plan.
Yeah.
Even when you don't have all the pieces of the puzzle yet.
Exactly.
I think it's easy to get caught up in the technical stuff, but we can't forget about the people involved.
Right.
How do we keep the team motivated and engaged in this process, especially when it can feel, challenging and uncertain?
That's a great point. And I think celebrating successes, even small ones,
can really make a difference.
Okay.
Acknowledge the team's hard work. And don't be afraid to acknowledge the challenges, too. Talk openly about the data limitations and the uncertainties, but also emphasize how important the team's efforts are.
Okay.
In navigating all of this.
So be honest, transparent, but also create that supportive environment where everyone feels like they're part of something important.
Exactly.
And what about professional development?
Oh, that's crucial too.
Okay.
Giving people opportunities to learn and grow. It can really boost their confidence.
Right.
And make them more invested in the process.
So you're investing in the team, basically?
Yeah, both professionally and emotionally.
Okay, so we've got collaboration, but what about those times when we're just stuck, Despite all our best efforts, those conservative ranges aren't working. Or the data we're getting is just raising more questions than answers.
Those can be tough situations.
Yeah.
But it's important not to give up. Sometimes you need a fresh perspective.
Right.
Someone who can see the problem from a different angle.
We talked about consulting with outside experts. So when does it make sense to bring in those external advisors?
Well, I think it's a good idea when you're dealing with a really tricky technical issue.
Okay.
Like setting specs for a new drug delivery system.
Okay.
Or if your team just doesn't have experience in a certain area.
Right.
Like advanced statistical modeling.
So you're filling in those knowledge gaps.
Exactly, exactly.
Okay, and what should we look for in a potential consultant?
Look for someone who's done this before, someone with
Okay.
a proven track record in the area where you need help.
Huh?
They should understand the regulatory requirements
Right.
and have a practical approach to solving problems.
So experience, expertise, and a collaborative mindset.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, what are some questions we should ask
Yeah.
to make sure they're a good fit for our needs?
Well, ask about their experience with similar projects,
Okay.
how they approach working with limited data,
Mm-hmm.
and their communication style.
Okay.
You want someone who can, like, explain complex things clearly,
Right.
work well with your team,
Uh-huh.
and give you recommendations that you can actually use.
So it's like interviewing for a key role on your team.
Exactly, exactly.
Okay, now even with expert help,
Yeah.
there can still be unexpected challenges.
Oh, for sure.
What are some common pitfalls to watch out for when we're setting these specs with limited data?
One common one is setting the specs too tight too early on.
Okay.
When you don't have much data,
Yeah.
it's tempting to try to get those specs really precise right away.
Right, you want that certainty.
Yeah, exactly. But you have to remember that those early specs,
Mm-hmm.
they're often based on assumptions and preliminary data.
Yeah.
If you make those ranges too narrow,
Mm-hmm.
you might run into trouble later
Okay.
as you get more data and understand the drug and the process better.
So it goes back to being conservative,
Yeah.
giving yourself some wiggle room.
Exactly.
Okay. And what else? What other pitfalls?
Another one is relying too much on, like, anecdotal evidence or expert opinion.
Okay.
Those things can be helpful,
Mm-hmm.
but you got to back up your decisions with solid data.
Right. So it's about finding that balance
Yeah.
between expert opinions and actual evidence,
Exactly.
making sure those specs are scientifically sound.
Yes. Yes.
And we can't forget about ongoing
So
monitoring.
that's crucial.
Right.
Setting specs isn't a one-time thing.
Right.
It's an ongoing process.
Yeah.
You have to be paying attention
Mm-hmm.
and be willing to adapt as new information comes up.
So it's like tending a garden.
Yeah, I like that.
You plant the seeds, but then you have to water, fertilize, prune
Right.
to make sure those plants flourish.
Exactly. And speaking of tending to those specs,
Yeah.
let's talk about how to make sure those conservative ranges don't become too restrictive
Okay.
as we get more data and move towards full-scale production.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
It's about finding that balance, right?
Right.
Between being cautious and being realistic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, is it?
Actually, why don't we hold that thought for just a second? We'll
Leave-
dive into those strategies and wrap up our discussion after a quick message.
All right. Sounds good.
Stay with us.
All right, welcome back. We've been talking about this tricky business of setting drug specifications when you just don't have a lot of data to work with. I'm ready to wrap things up with some key takeaways.
Okay.
Things our listeners can actually use.
Sounds good.
So if you had to boil it all down to a few main principles, what would they be?
Well, I think adaptability is super important.
Okay, adaptability.
Yeah. When you're dealing with limited data, you can't be too rigid.
Right.
You have to be ready to adjust those specifications as you learn more.
So it's like setting off on a journey with only half a map. I've got to be prepared to change course along the way.
Yep.
So flexibility is key.
Yeah.
What else should our listeners keep in mind?
I'd say don't underestimate the importance of transparency.
Okay,
Yeah,
front-loading that.
be open with your team, your stakeholders,
Right.
and especially the regulators
Okay.
about the data limitations
Right.
and why you made the decisions you did.
So open communication, it builds trust.
Exactly.
And it helps everyone work together,
Yep.
which is so important when you're facing a challenge like this.
Absolutely.
And speaking of working together, we've talked a lot about collaboration
Mm.
involving those different teams.
Right.
Any final tips on how to make that collaboration really work?
I'd say create a culture where different perspectives are not just allowed,
Right.
but they're actually encouraged.
Okay.
Make sure everyone feels like they can contribute
Right.
and that their ideas are
So
heard.
it's not just about having people in the room.
No,
It's about making them feel like they're part of the solution.
exactly.
Okay, and of course, we can't forget about documentation.
Oh, yeah, that's crucial.
So important. Why is it so important?
Well, documentation, it's like a history of your project.
Okay.
It helps you keep track of everything,
Mm-hmm.
understand why you made certain decisions,
Right.
and stay consistent.
Okay.
Plus, if anyone ever has questions about a specific specification,
Yeah.
you've got a record to refer back to.
So it's like a detailed map of your journey.
Yeah.
Not just for the regulators, but for your own team.
Exactly.
So you can see how you got to where you are.
Yep.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away?
I'd say even when data is limited, you can still develop drugs successfully. If you plan carefully, think strategically, and stay focused on quality.
Right.
Don't be afraid of the challenges.
Right.
Use the resources you have, and always be looking for ways to improve.
That's a great message.
Yeah.
It's not about having all the answers right away. It's about having the right mindset and being willing to learn and adapt as you go.
Exactly.
So, to our listeners out there, as you work on setting drug specifications, remember what we talked about today, and always aim high, even when data is scarce.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us.
It was great to be here.